There's always that one special event, the one you can't miss. The invite usually starts with mark your calendars. Well, mark your calendars for this Saturday and Sunday. You're going to a Vintage Computer Festival. That's right. It's a celebration of 40 years since the first bite of the apple and a wonder-filled experience of past innovation displayed like never before. You're going to want to share it with friends and the entire family. Greetings, everyone, and welcome from the Technology Association of Georgia. It's Tuesday, March 29th, 2016, and this is your personal invitation to experience the Vintage Computer Festival Southeast, a fascinating connection with our communal past in a chronology of the last 4 decades as we embrace technology from the first time we ever used a computer to the last time you used a GPS system to find the festival. It begins with a 6,000 square foot pop-up display that covers the rich history of Apple and Steve Jobs, another 7,600 square feet that presents a world of personal computing, including the big names such as IBM, Microsoft, and of course Bill Gates. There's more. Over 30 exhibits of individual collectors with examples rarely seen, no less presented in public. All this and more in an old Comp USA building in Roswell that is a special development location for the Computer Museum of America. The Vintage Computer Festival for the Southeastern United States. It's a happening of hobbyists, serious collectors, and the outright curious weekend day tripper looking for something really unique to do. Children will marvel at the excitement. You at the ultimate rarity of what is known by collectors and museums around the world as an Apple I. Even interactive entertainment, that's right, including vintage gaming on originally restored computers and video game systems, plus hands-on soldering for children of all ages to experience just how computers are constructed. It's a Tech Talk, all about the Vintage Computer Festival Southeast this weekend, co-hosted by the Atlanta Historical Computing Society and the Computer Museum of America. Up to the Tech Talk, we speak with Lonnie Mimms, president and founder of the Computer Museum of America, and one of the most recognized vintage technology experts whose collection numbers more than 250,000 technological artifacts. A highly successful entrepreneur and commercial real estate developer, his true passion is his commitment to innovation. As he puts it, past, P-A-S-T, forward. It's Apple, IBM, and beyond as we Tech Talk Vintage Computer Fest 2016 with its co-host and the president of the Computer Museum of America, Lonnie Mimms. This edition of Tech Talk is brought to you by GlobalSpeak.com, new media consultants, corporate video and audio communications, video and audio production and distribution, live and virtual event production. Tag TV and Tag Radio is a service of GlobalSpeak.com, creatively delivering powerful marketing, video, and audio solutions. Lonnie, welcome to Tech Talk.
Frank, it's good to be here.
Pretty exciting. The deadline's getting closer each day. I'm sure the countdown's on. Big weekend. Want to cover a couple of things as we talk about the Vintage Festival, obviously, but I want to give a sense of perspective to some of the things that you've got that are happening, not only to you personally, but to a vision that you've got for a greater use of what most people will say is a pretty extensive collection as far as just overall vintage artifacts are concerned. So let's start with that. Let's talk a little bit about the collection itself, your personal collection, and what is your vision for it now and obviously in the future?
Well, the collection started literally with the first personal computer that I had, first microcomputer, and it was back in the mid-'70s. It was a Sol 20 by Processor Technology based upon an 8080, and since that point, just been continually collecting from all different sources, from former engineers of the companies, from garage sales, from eBay, all over the place. And the idea is that we can use this collection as a core for a technology center and for a technology museum, and keep them out of the landfill.
Well, I read just recently an article that was talking about how some of the people at Apple, they say they're so busy inventing the future that they really don't have time to celebrate the past, and I think that there's a big misunderstanding in terms of the value of having the what I guess is a narrative that continues innovation from the past to the current to the future. Is that the way you kind of see it? I mean, is it just a case of preventing it from landfill, or do these artifacts really need to be remembered?
Oh, absolutely they do. Even though they may have that as a kind of the company line, if you will, Even within Apple itself, you can look at past products that may not have been very successful and clearly were ahead of their time, that the technology was incorporated, or at least certainly the ideas were incorporated into current products that are very successful.
Well, you've got what now constitutes, I guess, a center of development, for lack of a better description. I know that you've taken over a former Comp USA building, fairly sizable one, several thousand, 10 or what is it, about 30 or 40,000 square foot building that you guys have now?
The building we're in right now is approximately 36,000 square feet.
And the exhibits themselves, what you're doing there is in a sort of I'm trying to describe what I think is a pretty unique concept. It's sort of like a laboratory where you're not only developing the areas on how to promote and how to use these artifacts for display, but also actually have what you call a pop-up exhibit, taking up, I'm guessing again, several thousand square feet, just focused on the Apple chronology.
We created an Apple pop-up museum, Apple pop-up exhibit, that is in just under 6,000 square feet of what used to be the offices for the CompUSA regional headquarters. And by taking over an existing office, it was very much an experiment, and it's not your perfect ideal museum layout if you could do it, in a totally open virgin space. But nonetheless, I think we really came up with a very creative layout and tell the story of the history in what hopefully the public will see as a very interesting way.
Well, I've had the privilege in having a tour, and thank you for doing it, but I got to tell you, it is really overwhelming. It really does take a tremendous amount. In this case, I know today, the overall Apple is looking at 40 years. It takes a chronology and basically narrows it down to some really fascinating overviews that takes you through the chronology so quickly. I'll tell you, for our listening audience, if you really haven't seen it, and you probably haven't, because part of what I want to explore with you, too, is that it's actually not open to the public, at least not on a general basis. But when you have a chance to actually get in and take a look at what you've put together, if you're interested at all in Apple, you got to see it. If you've ever been involved in a computer in your history over the evolution of either your personal or professional life, you got to see it. I mean, it's just one of those things that on the top of your head you would say, vintage computers or a museum on computers. Why would I be interested in? The answer is go out and take a look at this collection, because it's pretty amazing. Now let's talk a little bit about the fact of two things. One, I'm talking about version 4.0. I think you guys have dubbed this recent actual introduction of the Vintage Computer Festival Southeast 4.0. It's an interesting activity that coincides. You guys host it. I know this is probably third, fourth year you've hosted it there, but it is part of the total overall festival, the Apple pop-up is. But go into the actual Vintage Computer Festival itself.
Okay, this is the fourth year that we've hosted at this particular site, and hope to do so for many years to come. Maybe not at this site, maybe at our permanent facility when that gets established. But what the Vintage Festival is it's a very hands-on show where folks that have been into the hobby of restoring vintage computers and vintage games will be displaying their wares and letting folks actually play on the machines. There'll be a section that'll be hands-on for kids and adults to solder together various circuit boards. I think they're going to have the Mini Simon game, memory game. They're going to have the watch, which is billed as a not so smart watch. It only tells the time, and a couple other fun things that you can put together.
Well, and the way you're describing it is, certainly it's for the, I hate to use the term geeks in a negative way, because it's not. In this particular case, we're going back to the hobbyists that began the whole evolution of the personal computer that have evolved now into what has become, I would say, millenniums who are using the technology and probably don't have any real context of how it all began and where it all started from. And one of the great parts is this isn't just a geeky experience, I think, for lack of a better description. It's really a family experience to maybe join in with some of your kids or your grandkids and even your friends that have evolved with you on a personal basis. Once you go into this environment, there's something magical. I don't want to get overwhelmed by magical, maybe not the right term, but there's something special that happens when you get a chance to see all of this all at one place, all at one time. And then to add the advantage of having the enthusiasts that are there, the individual, and am I correct in saying something like 30 individual exhibits beyond the overall major visit of the pop-up exhibit?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. So, and you mentioned the soldering. You might want to go into a little bit of detail about that, because I know that coming from the last year when I had an opportunity to go by, a couple of my friends said, "Oh, did you?" I had my daughter use it, and that's the part she remembered the most. She still talks about it today. Talk a little bit about what they'll experience if they brought their kids with them.
Okay, well, the hands-on part where you can create your own, or I should say, put together your own circuit boards. It really is following along with the whole idea of the maker movement. And if you're not familiar with that, we're at the point now where everything has become so disposable. And back whenever these hobbyists were starting to put computers together, you could do amazing things on your own, and you would literally get down to designing pieces and parts and putting them together. Well, this portion where you can go in and you can put the parts into a board, and you can actually solder them together, and you start with the individual components and you end up with a working device. And it just shows you the whole background of how the more complicated electronics come about, which we're really removed from that in the current age. And I think people have a desire to do things with their hands and to get back to how is that done? How do you make that? How do you put it together? And you may be aware that there's maker fairs now that are in cities all over the world. To do kind of this exact thing, not necessarily with just electronics, but with all aspects of life.
Now, we talked about the museum itself being a pop-up museum, and the bigger vision is to have what I'll call a tech complex of innovation and maybe discovery, entrepreneurship, and other kinds of development in the future. But as it sits now, I think for our listeners, they may be curious, why isn't it open to the public on a consistent basis? And I'm going to guess it's about the rarity of some of the artifacts. I know, for example, Apple I's that you've got, and some pieces that idealistically are not even necessarily open to the public anywhere for anybody to see them.
We have, we're at the stage now of creating the center to where we just hired our first full-time person to work at the center, and I'm hoping that we will be able to open up on a limited basis, maybe one weekend each month in the very near future. But a lot of it just has to do with the organization, getting the staffing, getting the comfort levels with being able to have the different artifacts secure, and all that's coming together.
Well, and the other part of it also is it's not a static effort. Obviously, it's a dynamic in the sense that not only do you have the collection that you have today, you also have pretty much a huge archive. I understand literally something in like 250,000 actual pieces or documents of one kind or another that are in storage, and yet the search goes on. You mentioned something that I think some of our listeners would maybe find interesting to go into a little bit more detail on, and that is otherwise they end up in a landfill. What happens in most cases is if it's an old piece of, in fact, I'm probably conditioned that if I've got a 1.0 or a 3.0 or a 7.0 and there's an 8.0, I got to throw what I've got out. And here's a case where maybe that's not necessarily the thing you want to do. Talk a little bit about the actual value of some of these pieces after their primary use.
Well, that is so true. I mean, the technology now is moving so incredibly quickly that whereas your washing machine or dryer might last for upwards of a decade, your phone, your computer, the things that you use that are electronic, they basically are outdated almost as soon as you get it home, that they were already on the second and third phase of that item in development, and within 6 months, you'll have something that will be better than what you're currently using. With most other areas, it's a much more gradual evolution. So what that does is it creates a time period on these various items to where as soon as they're not the cutting edge of technology, they become worthless very quickly, and it's actually a negative value, because we end up spending money to recycle them, because there are some hazardous materials in a lot of these things, the batteries and various other materials that they're made out of. You want to be careful as to how you dispose of them. But what we found is that and I don't necessarily want to encourage everybody to, hold on to everything forever, because it's not a universal truth. Everything is not going to be worth a fortune. Mm-hmm. There's so many millions of iPhones that were made that they're not going to be worth anything, in my opinion. But unless you've got one that's in the box and it's pristine and it's 50 years from now, then certainly that will have a value. But in general, when all these things get recycled and disposed of, especially in the early days when there weren't such a high volume made, what we found is that there aren't that many of certain things left. One of the kind of the pinnacle of that is the Apple I, of which they originally were slated to make 200 of in two different batches of 100 each. And the story is that there probably was around 170 ultimately that were actually fully assembled and put together, but through attrition and just the number of years that have gone by before anybody really thought about it, there's probably less than 50 of the original group that's still in existence. And the high water mark was set when the Ford Museum paid just under $1 million for one.
Well, it just covers the gambit. Obviously, 30 individuals or more that will be showing their own personal collections of one variation or another, exhibits of early games, and also not to forget about IBM, Microsoft, and even Gates' story, because the chronology maybe focuses all about the history of Steve Jobs and so much more. Like you say, the Apple I and even the first disc, I guess the first disc 2, and the controller card, and also the original Lisa. And I love the story that you tell about how that name came about. And when the people visit, if you don't already know, you'll find out how Steve Jobs came up with the name, or some people think he came up with the name Lisa. We'll kind of tease that a little bit, Lonnie, and let them go there and find out for themselves. But it's a entertaining and fascinating afternoon, highly educational, great for a spring, great weather I think we're anticipating having. It's inside. It's something not only that you can enjoy by yourself, bring a friend, but also bring the kids, because I think it's something you're going to really like. Not to sound too promotive, but I think the bottom line is college students are admitted free with a card, obviously, and 17 and younger are admitted free. And if you want to find out more information, I think the best thing to do would be to just go to the on-site computermuseumofamerica.com, look under events, and you'll get all the details. Lonnie, I think this is our first opportunity to talk on Tech Talk about the museum and about some of your collection. I got a feeling we're going to do it more often as things begin to progress and you get more and more into the realm of either opening the museum on a regular basis or even hearing more about your ultimate vision and what your plan is. But for the moment, it's a great weekend, a lot of excitement. I know you're ending up with the 11th hour and putting all of the details and finishing touches. I would say thank you so much for taking time, what I know is an extremely busy schedule, to join us for a few minutes today on Tech Talk.
Thank you very much, Frank, and it's my pleasure. I hope to see a lot of your listeners at the show.